Welcome back. I am John P. Today we are going to be talking about 5 watches that, in my opinion, every watch collector needs to experience. These are going to be watches that I know in the comments below so many people are going to chime in about their experience either owning these watches or wearing them, or perhaps some history about them in their personal collection or their family. I would love to see and hear all of that in the comments below. On the wrist today, before we jump into that, is going to be my Rolex Oyster Perpetual 39 Red Grape. If you watch this channel, you know I'm always wearing this watch. I have other watches and so many others, and of course, you know, with Del Rey watch, there's just so many watches that pass across my wrist, but I always find myself jumping towards this watch, and it's going to be for a similar reason probably as the watch I'm going to mention here first on the list, but it's just so versatile, and I just always find myself gravitating towards the simplicity behind this and the versatility as well. And once again, please do not forget to check out delreywatch.com, where we buy, sell, trade watches, sinclairstraps.com for the best premium watch straps, as well as my Instagram, The Real John P. So the first watch in the list of watches that, in my opinion, every watch collector should experience is going to be a modern, and the key word here is modern, Rolex Datejust or Submariner. Now, for many people, this is going to be a no-brainer. This is going to be obvious, but there is a bit of a divide in watch collectors today of people that either buy into the Rolex mentality and they do like the products for what they are, the watches for what they are, and then there's also people that maybe feel that the brand is not geared for, pun intended, collectors, and they're not really focused on collectors because you can't really get one, and you know, the whole thing with waiting lists and, you know, them becoming more of luxury goods, right? There is that divide, but because of the fact that there are waiting lists, it can be difficult to experience the modern versions of these watches. But I think it's better explained by sharing with you my experience when I first started watch collecting years ago. You know, I first got into vintage watches, and with vintage watches, you know, they do have outdated technology for the most part. You know, the quality of vintage watches overall on average is much lower than modern watches today, especially their counterparts or either more newer models from the same brands, right? A vintage Datejust is going to be of lower quality than the modern Datejust because Rolex has spent the years and years in decades really improving not only the watch, but also the bracelets and so many other things, right? And that's part of the reason that, in my opinion, either the Submariner or the Datejust modern version need to be experienced. There's something to be said about having a product that looks so similar to something from 50 years ago plus, oftentimes, but yet everything has been improved upon so many times iteratively, and the overall look and aesthetic is so similar, right? How many products out there in the market can be said about that and still look timeless? There's not a lot of products that I can think of where that is the case. And because of that, you truly get a watch that has gone through so many different trials and tests, right? So many people have put that exact watch over the years on their wrist. They've been able to improve it in so many ways to give you the best experience that they feel, at least the best experience possible. And there's something to be said about that, right? Particularly the Oyster bracelet. I think the Oyster bracelet is probably the most comfortable watch bracelet that exists. And it makes sense because they've been working on it for so long. They've had the much more time than so many other brands have the ability to have been able to do. And so because of that, the quality is truly just so high. Now, I'm not saying that they're the most complex watches or that the most finely decorated or that the dial construction is the best in the world, because we can all pick out examples where there are brands that focus more on those things. But in terms of giving you an overall experience, there's something to be said about that. And I think there probably is some psychology in play as well, right? I mean, we're talking about a brand and watches, these watch models that are just in so many movies and so many pop culture references, on so many people's wrists, on so many billboards. The amount of times that you've seen these watches, that I've seen these watches, is just thousands of times likely. And there's something to be said about that, probably, of, you know, if you haven't experienced it and you finally do put it on your wrist and you see it there on your wrist, maybe you haven't walked into the authorized dealer or they haven't had it in stock, but you finally do. There's something to be said about that. I know the first time that was the case for me, I just thought it was so amazing, particularly to have it on the wrist. And it was just a very interesting experience. Now, I don't wear the Datejust. I don't really need the date, which is why I wear the Oyster Perpetual, but I think a lot of these things do come into play when we're talking about it. So even if you don't put the watch in your collection for so many different reasons, I think it's just worth the experience to at least try it out, put it on the wrist, and not just kind of make kind of your opinion on it based on the photos. Now, next we have a watch for a very similar reason. This is going to be a Patek Philippe. Of course, a Patek Philippe Kalatrava 5196, or one of the other Kalatravas. But why I like the particular 5196 is going to be because it is in that lineage of the Patek 96. We're talking classic, quintessential, simple dress watch that so many other brands, if not every other brand that tried to make a dress watch, kind of considered and modeled themselves after. Now, this is going to have the seconds hand running at the 6 o'clock position, but once again, much like the Datejust and the Submariner, this kind of Patek 96 lineage or family of watches, while it has changed, it has been improved upon, it still has that true heritage there. And so whether you get the Patek Philippe Kalatrava from 50 years ago or today, you put it on the wrist, and much like the previous watch that we just talked about, the modern Rolex watches, there's something to be said about that. There's a certain feeling that comes into play for many people, myself included, and you put it on your wrist, and there's kind of this feeling of, this is it, right? You look at it and you say, this is it. This is dress watch. And I was, interestingly enough, sitting on the plane recently coming back home, and this is a similar experience that was shared with me, which inspired this video from a fellow watch collector. And of all places, he happened to have been originally from Ukraine. And when he was growing up, his uncle showed him a Patek Philippe watch and said, one day you should strive to achieve this. And that kind of resonated with him. And, eventually, he was fortunate enough to be able to start collecting these Patek Philippe watches. And he shared this story to me about how when he first saw it in the store, he just fell in love and he felt like it was it, right? It was dress watch. It does not get any better. Now, once again, much like the Rolex watches, there are brands that specialize in certain things. And I'm not saying that Patek Philippe does everything better than everyone else, but certainly they are considered out there in the watch collecting world as kind of being a certain pinnacle or level of horology and heritage behind watchmaking. What do you think about the Patek Philippe Kalatrava? Of course, leave that in the comments below. Now, next, a very interesting experience in watches that I would recommend is the Volcane Cricket. Now, there's many people recently that have started collecting the Volcane Cricket. This is an alarm watch. It sounds different than something you'd hear from the likes of JLC with the Memovox or some of the other alarms that exist out there. This sounds kind of like a cricket, go figure. It buzzes. In my opinion, it's a little on the annoying side, but that's kind of part of the charm, right? There's kind of a joke running out there between, people that I know and other fellow watch collectors where they kind of let the cricket buzz off. And it's kind of that funny kind of thing that people like to do, because it does have that kind of little bit of annoyance factor to it, but it has that interesting, unique tone to it, and it's just fun. Now, these watches recently, the vintage Volcane Crickets, have become pretty desirable, especially in great conditions. So they are drying up, and there are not a lot of them out there really in good condition. So I would recommend picking one up sooner than later, or trying to find one in a store somewhere, which can be difficult because they are vintage watches. But it's just unique, fun, and quirky, and it has that certain novelty factor that I think draws so many people to the watch. Aside from, of course, there's plenty of heritage with the watch brand and model as well, being worn on the wrist of so many US presidents, and having a couple of interesting factoids about the watch that make it very important for horology, which I've talked about in the past, but you can find more information about this in either my videos or others on the internet. And of course, type into Google or YouTube Volcane Cricket alarm sound, and you can hear that classic sound if you haven't already, but worth the experience. Now, next, we're going to be talking about a complication. Now, this is a complication that when I first got into watch collecting, I first started watch collecting, I was reading about it, and you know kind of how it is. You kind of just dive in there deep and you look at all the resources. You go on the forums, you go on YouTube, everywhere else, and you just want to learn about so many things and everything about it. And something that does come up all the time, especially when you're looking at ultra high-end watches, is the tourbillon complication. Now, the tourbillon complication is essentially when the balance wheel and the escapement are placed inside a cage that rotates a little bit slower, which is supposed to negate the effects of gravity that are being exerted on the watch, which would make it less accurate for timekeeping. Though in modern day, this really isn't too much of a factor because of the precision involved with watchmaking and the way that parts are produced and just how far along watchmaking has come. But in earlier days, I mean, we're talking, hundreds of years ago, the tourbillon was supposed to be the kind of fix for this. Also, there is many debates going on out there by horologists and watchmakers that kind of contest that this ever truly improved the accuracy of the watches. We won't talk about that today, but I think it lends or supports the idea that in watches, you have these very unique things, right? The alarm, the tourbillon, that create experiences for different people for different reasons based on just it being oftentimes cool or novel or people being drawn to it for their own intrinsic reasons. And so when we talk about the tourbillon, particularly for me, it just kind of seemed at the time when I first got into watchmaking like the pinnacle of watches, right? One day I'll get a tourbillon, right? And so many watch collectors say that as well. You get into watches and it's like, one day I'm going to have a tourbillon in my collection because it kind of sits there on a pedestal of being something that is interesting and complex, and there's really no reason to have it. But oftentimes that's why we do have it, right? There's no reason really utility-wise to have a watch if we have a phone, but we have the watch. So why not put this cage in there that rotates around and does crazy things and charge you a lot more for it? And that's kind of what sometimes watches can be for some people. And so I was always drawn to that. And I remember this the first time seeing a tourbillon in person. I was just so astounded at that kind of technologically advanced mechanism that was in there just because it was in there with no real reason besides someone would likely want to purchase it if we think about it. So I was just completely astounded, and I hear this from people all the time when they get their first tourbillon or they see it for the first time. Luckily, some brands like Tag Heuer have come out with tourbillons that you can kind of pick up out there in the secondhand market around $15,000 US, which I understand is a bit of a steep price, but what this does mean is you can see them in stores because they have popped up. They have been made more readily available to the public. So at least if you don't want to put one in your watch collection because it just doesn't make sense for an everyday wear, you can experience one at a place like a Tag Heuer boutique or one of the other authorized dealers. Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments below. Now, last is going to be another classic timeless watch, the Omega Speedmaster Professional. Now, this is probably going, with the exception of the Volcane Cricket, this is going to be the most approachable watch in terms of price point on the list. And I think that does draw many people into it because for the price of a Speedmaster, there's very few other watches out there that have changed very little over the course of time. The Speedmaster Professional today looks a lot like the Speedmaster Professional from 50 years ago. Of course, once again, much like the Datejust, there have been improvements and changes, but you can put them side by side, and to the untrained eye, they will look very much the same, right? Similar aesthetic, and that draws a lot of people to it. It makes the watch classic, timeless, and an icon. It has that history and heritage of being the watch that's been on the moon, on so many people's wrists. You see the watch everywhere, and that contributes to the experience, right? I remember the first Speedmaster Professional that I personally purchased for myself. I truly was just impressed with it. I remember I had other watches before then, but the Speedmaster Professional, I didn't really have a reason to put it on my wrist, but then when I finally did, I finally found the place for it in my collection, it just made sense, right? It felt natural, it made sense, I looked at it, and once again, I think there is probably some psychology at play behind that, but I don't know that that's something we can necessarily control, right? The fact that so many people talk about it and it's everywhere. I don't know that that's something necessarily we can control, but certainly this is a watch that you should experience, even if you don't put it in your collection, just because of the fact that it plays such a major role and holds such an important place in horology and watches today. But what do you all think? Are there any other watches that you think that your fellow watch collectors should experience? I would love to see it and hear it in the comments below. Please do not forget to thumbs up, like, and subscribe. It really does help and go a long way. You can check out delraywatch.com where we buy, sell, and trade watches. And you can find me on Instagram, The Real John P. Thanks, guys. You've been chatting with John P.